Great. Thank you so much. And thanks to Rachel and the team here for both putting together, I think, what is a really important set of discussions over the next 2 days, but also just continuing to press for learnings around public-private partnerships since it's such an important issue. So I'm not going to go into too many details. I think our earlier speakers have set up a lot of very good conversation. It's also nice to see some old friends in the room here. But I think what we have a nice opportunity here with this panel is to dive a little bit deeper into some of the themes you've already heard this morning, and really try to think about a value proposition and how it relates to decision making for industry engagement and public-private partnerships. And we want to get a little bit deeper and explore some of the assumptions about why industry might engage, how they think about value. And hopefully we can keep this a pretty candid conversation. But I think by focusing on value proposition, it's to me, I think that's really the best place to be starting this conversation, because that is where I think it's if we can find ways to create value in all of these partnerships, that's certainly the key to finding meaningful engagement and more sustainable engagement and impact over time. And I think over the last decade or so, we've seen this evolution in how partnerships have changed, have looked for different ways to create value. I was sort of, as Seema mentioned, I previously was with USAID for about 6.5 years, but have been working at kind of this intersection of sort of business and the global public health community for quite a while. And I think I think it's been interesting to see how industry has chosen to engage differently over time. And when I was at USAID, we talked a lot about how there really were these sort of increase and aligned incentives for engagement. And just even understanding that is really important. So from the public sector, and I've talked about this through part of the PPP forum in the past, is that public sector, there really has been this sort of increased recognition that aid needs to leverage the private sector to achieve its development objectives. And I think you've seen this across, at least as I kind of go back and think about the different administrators at USAID, the last 4 administrators across 3 different administrations have all put a real emphasis on engaging the private sector to pursue its development agenda. And I think the current administrator at USAID is no exception, though I understand he doesn't like the term PPPs, but it's still, I think there's, it's a recognition that the development or the public sector can really not take on these development objectives on its own. The shift in flows of money going into countries used to be largely from the public sector. Now it's only 9%. And most of the flows are going in from the private sector. So that alone, and that kind of simple fact, means that the public sector needs to work with the private sector in ways that can make sure their development objectives can be achieved. And that means looking beyond traditional models of partnering and really thinking about sort of new models for development, new ways of partnering, engaging all different parts of the private sector. And I think we've seen lots of different models. And the private sector also has I think, changing reasons to engage, and certainly CSR has played an important role in a lot of impact that's been and value that's been created in health over many years, but we also are seeing increased market opportunities, and right now low and middle income countries are facing unprecedented economic expansion, and that creates market opportunities. It creates market opportunities in the health sector. You've got pharma spending in Africa is going to reach $45 billion by 20. That's real market value. We've got other sectors. You heard some of them this morning. We're also there playing a significant role in many of these markets. These are growing markets, and so figuring out how to expand market opportunity certainly creates reason, as you heard some great examples this morning of why to engage. So, and NGOs, of course, also have found reason to partner, and whether it is bringing in skills that they don't have, whether it's building up capacity, whether it's even thinking about how we bring in tech and better understand how to use data to solve our problems. I think there's a lot of reasons that we want to leverage some of the skills in the private sector that are not resident both in the public sector or in NGOs. So with all of that, I think we want to sort of dive in a bit. We're going to try to do some sort of pulling out lessons and insights through storytelling, and because we've got a lot of really great examples here from our very esteemed panel. And so I'm going to just quickly introduce everybody, and then we're going to just dive right in. And so I'm directly to my left, and I'm going to do very brief intros so we can get into the meat of this. But Brenda is Executive Director of Corporate Responsibility at Merck. She's also president of the Merck Foundation. She has been doing partnerships and building all kinds of partnerships that have led to significant impact, health impact. I wonder if you've ever done in your own personal reviews, your own metrics to figure out how many lives you've probably personally saved from all of your work, but it would be pretty impressive. So I encourage you to read her bio, and then also I think we'll hear some of your stories. Shawn Dolley is he's Director of Life Sciences and Healthcare at Cloudera, a more recent friend in the global health space, and has been doing some really exciting things on the data front and helping us think through how to build out a value proposition for industry engagement on the data side. So we'll bring some great insights. And then we also have Bruce Wilkinson, who is CEO of the Catholic Medical Mission Board, and Bruce has just a tremendous wealth of knowledge and depth of experience in developing and engaging in public-private partnerships that also to have had tremendous impact on many lives. And so I think we have a really nice opportunity to hear some real insights. So maybe just first, I'm going to ask you just to each of you give a little bit of a kind of quick 2-minute a top-level view on how and why your organization has chosen to engage in global health or in global health partnerships for you, Bruce. And Shawn, you're a little bit newer to this, but just give us a little bit more perspective, just so that we can get grounded in your different views. So starting, Brenda, you can go first.
Okay. So thank you, Wendy. So for those of you who know Merck, you know that our mission is to discover and develop important medicines to help address the world's greatest health challenges. And to use Brian's terminology from earlier, so health is actually our business. Engagement in what we're calling here global health, what we sometimes refer to as public health, or in under-resourced communities, is an important part of that mission. And just to give you some context, we do that in various different ways. First, we will do that sometimes through more traditional philanthropy or social investments. We also engage in initiatives that speak to shared value or mutually reinforcing social and business value. And we also do that through our commercial models. And again, just to remind you of Brian's good words of advice, that allows us to bring more of our core business expertise to the table. I'll mention that I think the value proposition is often influenced by or influences the type of model that we choose to engage on when we're looking at key public health challenges. So very quickly, I'll just tick off a few of the what I see as the elements of the value proposition for industry, and some of these you've heard. Peter Singer, I think, said it very well this morning, that we share that same number one reason for doing this, which is it enhances our mission. It helps us to contribute to saving and improving lives. I think we also recognize the important role that the private sector plays in public health and achieving the SDGs. So this is also a way for us to fulfill that commitment and that obligation and demonstrate our commitment to corporate responsibility. Relationships. I don't think we could say enough about how important the partnerships that we develop through this engagement are to us in terms of, some of our NGO partners that have really strong relationships at the local level. It helps us to build alliances. It helps us to engage in policy discussions. So can't say enough about how important relationships are to the value proposition. Business value. If you're looking at a shared value approach or a commercial approach, it gives us an opportunity to raise awareness of the company, our products, our expertise, potentially develop new markets, expand on existing markets. Learnings. We learn so much from the partners that we engage in the public health community. So it brings back a lot of best practices, a lot of new and innovative ways to work. And then finally, and I don't think this one's been mentioned yet today, the benefits to our workforce. We give our employees an opportunity to develop themselves. So we develop talent through public health engagement. And it's also with the new workforce coming on board, it's a way also to attract and retain talent. So those are some of the ones that come to mind. And again, depending on the type of engagement, I think you'll see elements of each of those.
Great. So, Shawn, let's shift to you. So Merck's been around for a long time, playing a very big role in the global health space. Cloudera is relatively new to the field, new to global health, but certainly even just one of our newer industries. And the tech sector is probably doesn't have as deep a history in global health. So maybe give us some thinking on sort of why you're spending some time thinking about global health and why your company would even let you do that.
Sure. Thank you. And from time to time, I'm on panels where the moderator knows significantly more and should be sitting in my seat. This is one of those times, so I'm honored to be invited. So as was mentioned, many of you may not know Cloudera, but I'm going to some degree, take my Cloudera hat off and act as an informal and unapproved representative of what I would call big tech. So there's probably, with Amazon and Facebook, Microsoft, Apple, Google, Intel, SAP, Cloudera, multi-billion-dollar software companies. And I've worked at a few of those, so I can say maybe some of my comments will be an amalgam or aggregate of lessons learned, value propositions, et cetera. So with that, there's multiple, I think, value propositions of why we get involved, and obviously just look at whatever your phone or your app or your self-driving car. Things are different than when I came into industry 20 years ago. Folks are asking us now to be involved, and there's more interest in technology and the skills that we have in our folks. So part of that is because we have things to give that may be more important to the effort than we did 20 years ago. I think most of those organizations know that the markets, especially less so maybe in non-communicable diseases, but in infectious diseases, this is not about a monetization or building out a market. Yes, it matters, but you could go to one hedge fund in Connecticut, where my colleague lives, and do as much as you could in an African country in a much shorter time frame. I think the ideology piece is so important, but there's a high interest in tech, and some of that is, let's say, selfish. There's so many things that folks in this room probably don't know that you could do that are very attractive, and big tech wouldn't even call it a declared interest. We wouldn't know to call it a declared interest, but through the communication, someone will say, so you're saying if we did a press release saying that you were a valued partner, that has value? You know, that's like convertible, it's bearer bonds, it's gold, it's money, and it's more valuable than money. So I could go on and on, but I would say there's less than 10 reasons that big tech gets involved across the spectrum. It differs slightly by company, but it's certainly an aggregated set. And in our industry, because we come from Northern California, because we're insulated, because not the DNA, but let's say the RNA, that we've been encouraged to produce these proteins of independence and don't tell us how we can do it, lead us to less value the partnerships that once you're exposed and you break down your ideology, you realize it can't be done in any other way. I think, but is more and more starting to be recognized that, you know, big tech isn't going to be able to go do this. No one's going to let them go in by themselves and just, you know, do things or extract data and disenfranchise people of their data. It's a learning process. Anyway, that's, yeah.
Just to follow up, so you think that there's been even an evolution within the tech industry of needing to partner more to continue to say, I want to make sure I understood that. So
yeah.
The value of partnerships has increased a bit more as the industry has sort of realized some constraints.
And we don't. It's an amazing story. But I had someone come to me just 2 weeks ago and say they sat down with someone from big tech. The company shouldn't be identified, and you know, you'll have these end of spectrum folks who say, you realize in 20 years our company is going to be running, insert African country name. You know, we're going to be running Ghana. And anyone in this room would say, that's pure insanity. How do you even incubate such an idea? But I would say to the ideology comment, if I take what Peter said this morning and say, how do you break down an ideology? Well, one way is exposure. The more we're invited to the table and the more exposure we get to folks in this room, unfortunately with big tech, more often what breaks down the barrier is they'll go in with a crazy plan and someone will say, no, we're not giving you this data, or no, we're not giving you this money, or no, we're not letting you control the streets, you know, the stoplights of our largest city for your experiment. And like anyone coming to maturity, you know, failure and the word no make them either leave or stay and finally listen. And so I think now folks are realizing, okay, this community is willing to train us. They're willing to teach us. If you do these 6 things, and as long as you don't break out of these barriers, you can be in the club. And so, yeah.
Great. All right. Well, we're clearly going to have some good stuff to dive into here. So maybe before we do that, so Bruce, just can you talk a little bit about, you know, from your side, you have a perspective of an NGO, you've engaged with the private sector. You want to talk a little bit about sort of the value creation from your side and why you think partnering with the private sector is so important, and where you think they've seen value, since this is the industry perspective.
Thanks, Wendy. I felt a little self-conscious, Rachel. I was sitting at a table which no one else was sitting at today, and I was wondering if that's because I'm from the civil society sector, or perhaps maybe we're in a global health group and there's some kind of contagion going on here. I don't know. And Shawn actually asked me for advice on raising a 16-year-old, so I felt I might be able to share some of that afterwards, right? And it will be all sheer opinion, but I represent Catholic Medical Mission Order, CMMB. We like to use the CMMB. We've been around 108 years now. Jesuit-inspired global health organization focused pretty much on the most vulnerable, I can say. And so our real sort of where we actually add value is on women and children's health. And we basically do what I'd call health system strengthening work, and stay with partners over the long term to build out their capacity to respond to the community's needs in terms of changing health-seeking behaviors and actually initiating so that these communities actually know a lot more about their health and actually are seeking better health outcomes. So that's really what we do, and we do that through volunteers. We do that through distributing medicines. We do that through implementing programs around all the infectious disease and all the sort of what I call the chronic side. And I think one of the places I'd encourage us to think deeply about is women's health, and especially women who are not actually having access. And these vulnerable populations, what the World Bank calls those living in extreme poverty, right? I think we have a place that I would ask this group to even consider how you actually are seeking to actually access those population groups, because they are actually very difficult, but they can be done, and I think the private sector. So on the value proposition, I've worked a lot in the public-private. In fact, Brian, I was on Tommy Thompson's famous trip going into Africa in 2000. What were we, 2004? You know, the pharma companies, all the CEOs. It was really funny. We booked a U.S. government plane out of Germany to take most of the CEOs of the pharma companies with us. However, there are like 4 companies who had to use their private jets to meet us in the various locations in Africa. But I remember Tommy Thompson leading the charge, and back in the early days of the PEPFAR sort of launch and initiative, it was built into the DNA that there was a sense that the private sector is absolutely critical. Pharma companies are absolutely key to what we can do together. So I come from a bit of the sort of civil society sector that actually is saying, I don't think business is doing enough. Okay, so I would like to see more. I do think the skills in the business sector are absolutely critical. I also think you're missing the point around when you have all this client data, and I'm going to look at Shawn and look at the business community. From a civil society perspective, we work in community. We work with those communities. Those communities are actually the base. They're your clients. You know more about these communities. Tech knows more about these communities. And yet we still think that the civil society organizations are the repository of the great relationships and the great sort of understandings. And I would challenge that even from our own sector, and I would say there is a mutuality in that of really getting to know what is going to actually assure what I call health-seeking behavior outcomes in the long term. I think we really need to share what we understand, because if you're going to sustain health interventions and improve people's health, that's the most underleveraged group that you can build all these partnerships off of, both in their own governments, within the business sector, and in also what their civil society relationships are. So again, I think there's a lot of interplay in that space.
Great. Well, thank you all. I think that was a nice way to start us off. And so I want to see if we can get a few stories out on the table. I've asked everyone to think about some stories, good and bad, that are going to help draw out some of these insights. We may not be able to get all of them out here, but maybe, Brenda, to go back to you, can you maybe share some story from one of the many partnerships you've worked on where it really highlights the role of the value proposition in sort of what made a successful partnership? And so dive in.
So I'm gonna use a more traditional example to start, and it's our 31-year-old Mectazan donation program, which when I call it traditional, it's more in the philanthropy space. But the reason I'm selecting that one is because when this started 31 years ago, it was really one of the first, if not the first of its kind, in terms of public-private partnership and its focus. And for those of you who are not familiar with it, it is a pretty broad partnership to address now 2 diseases, onchocerciasis or river blindness and lymphatic filariasis, primarily in sub-Saharan Africa, in parts of Latin America, and in Yemen in the Middle East. And the reason I select that one is because, at the time, the value proposition was not necessarily something we gave a lot of thought to. We knew we had, a product that could address this disease. We knew it was the only safe and effective product to address it. And we kind of dove in and figured we'd worry about the rest as we went along. The reason I think it's such a great example is because we kind of took a leap of faith and said, we'll surround ourselves with public health experts, non-governmental organizations, governments, WHO, the World Bank. So we brought all of the necessary partners to the table. And I think for us, what was valuable in that is, first of all, that was extremely critical to the success of the program. If we had not brought all of those partners, and each partner had you know, a unique contribution. So again, I keep referring to Brian's talk, but, you know, this idea of having partners around the table, each of whom have something to bring to the table. I would also say that each of those partners also needs to have their own value proposition, because if you have a partner without a value proposition, I think that's where you can run into some challenges in terms of sustainability. But that really helped us develop our relationship with WHO, with the World Bank, with a broad set of non-governmental organizations at a time when we were just really starting to go beyond sort of our focus on the developed world and more into the developing world. And again, this was 32 years ago. So it brought that type of value to us. And then, you know, once you establish those relationships, you can then build on those relationships and do other things, whether they're part of your, you know, corporate responsibility space, whether they're part of your sort of hardcore commercial business. All of that then comes together, and you're better able to align those two. I also would say, and I mentioned the workforce benefits that these engagements have. You know, I can't tell you how many folks have come to me who've started at Merck and said, one of the reasons I chose Merck was because of this engagement, because of you know, what you're doing in this space. So I think that's one really good example. And just because I'm kind of obsessed with the workforce benefits right now, the only other thing that I mention is we also have what we call a Global Health Fellowship, where we select employees each year from our top talent employees to spend 3 months in the field with a participating non-governmental organization, where the NGO tells us what they need, and then we identify people with those skills. So whether it's their financial skills, marketing skills, research capabilities, regulatory capabilities, whatever it might be, and we send these folks out to work in the field with those partners. That's also demonstrated sort of the value that we bring to the workforce by doing things like that. So we help build capacity in the areas that they're working in, but those individuals bring so much back to the organization that they then incorporate into their, you know, operational day-to-day work, and it really just helps build our expertise and our knowledge in areas that we normally might not have that expertise.
Great. So, Bruce, do you, based on your experience with partnerships, do you have thoughts in terms of, do you want to elaborate on what Brenda has talked about in terms of some of the benefits you've seen on where the value is to both you and to industry in partnering? Brenda doesn't know I'm going to do this, but we just had 4 of the Merck fellows over at CMMB, and so it was a wonderful experience, and they brought expertise in areas that we really did, and they actually pitched up for, I think it's a 3-month period, which was really brilliant, and they actually got to go see some of our work in the country office context and actually help in those contexts. So it was a great experience for us, as well as I hope it was for your volunteers. They seem to be big fans these days. I also want to just highlight, I was in the north of Ghana, living in the north of Ghana, when we were back doing spraying for the vector and onchocerciasis and trying to knock it out back in the early days before actually this program began. And it was just a one-tenant sort of program, which really needed to have the elimination within the population groups of ridding it in the sort of the host. And we were spraying rivers back in the early days. Believe it or not, that vector only lays the eggs, so that fly, in fast-moving waters. So they had these crazy Viking helicopter groups, former RAF folks, dropping insecticides in rivers at very high speeds and dangerous conditions. But that's a whole nother. And they took me up and showed me how it was done. I said, once is enough, thank you. But so I was going to give an example. It's a PEPFAR example, and I'll just do it very briefly. Which started to bring in. I went to Zambia in 2004, leaving Washington D.C. because Washington's wonderful, but it's probably the most uncivilized place I've ever lived, and I've spent 30 years in Africa. So anyway, no, but I did go back and headed up a very large HIV and AIDS program, and really what happened in that program was that we had the 30 million PEPFAR commitment originally, and then we grew it to 60 million. And then we had a corporate place that started at 1 million in what we had to have cost share, and then we ended up actually having $180 million invested from the corporate and foundation world, right? So over a period of 5 years. So they started to get significant. We had 23,000 caregivers who were trained, 96% retention rate. This was all in Zambia, a national level program.
We had about 250 organizations that worked with us in this. And basically, we were bringing people into care and treatment. So in the first 5 months, we put 72,000 people on treatment, okay, in Zambia, in the early stages of HIV. We had a country that was basically spiraling down, right, because people were losing their family and friends and the workforces were being impacted, orphaning. Every 1 in 6 children were orphaned, right? That was the level of distress or stress that society was under. And so I had worked previously in my career in the civil wars of Liberia and Sierra Leone during the 90s. And this was, you remember the atrocities that were committed in terms of mobilizing youth to be fighters and to take over and to become. And part of what I learned in that space was if we did not stem this HIV and AIDS piece in the countries that were really in that sort of spiral, and Brian mentioned a little bit the triple threats. It was also the triple threats of malaria, TB, and HIV in these days. And the spiraling, it has to stop, or it's going to become a place where the society will start to disintegrate and start to choose its own means to protect itself and to seek its own way forward. And the Eastern and Southern African societies definitely were in a place where they just were very fragile. And so that's where this kind of a program came in. And I'll just describe a few of the partners that actually entered into this. And it was, I would like to think it was our brilliance. In some ways, you think these things, but it was, so for example, we had the 23,000 caregivers. We tested over 500,000 people. We had 75,000 on treatment. We had 285,000 children being cared for on a weekly basis, children that were orphaned by HIV, by these community caregivers, they were brilliant. And they were the key to the success because there were people in their own society who chose to give back and say, I want to help. And that's where I go back to the sort of it really is about the people at the base of the society and the way they think about their own lives. And if they're choosing health-seeking behaviors and wanting to contribute back to their communities, they will sustain these initiatives. And these people became trained in malaria and TB. These people they were starting to do testing. So we took RDTs in. The malaria community screamed at us. So, sorry, they screamed at us in 2005 because we brought in RDTs, which were quote-unquote untested, and how are you going to use a rapid diagnostic test for malaria at the household level. We took HIV/AIDS testing into the households in 2007. Not at clinics, into the households. Mark Dybel told me he's going to pull my funding. I said, okay, pull the funding and watch the reaction. We had 25,000 bicycles donated, or actually World Bicycle Relief, going to Shram Corporation, set up a system now where they're building a quality bike in Africa because they came and helped us with 25,000 bicycles for the caregivers to reach the homes because they needed mobility, right? So talk about value proposition, very specific. We had, we got Hasbro. Sat with Brian Goldman, CEO, Hasbro. He said, Bruce, we'd love to help. And he says, what's the magnitude? And he's with his all senior staff. He says, what do you want us to do for you? He said, we want to give gifts for children. We want toys for children because we know there's psychosocial aspects of this that could really be helpful. We'll give them dolls they can hug and this, whatever you want. Just tell us what you want. How many do you need? I said 250,000. And it got very quiet. And I left it. It was quiet. I just sat back. Hasbro ended up giving 240,000 toys of our choice, brand new toys. They provided 4 20-ton trucks, beautiful, right? I mean, so Hasbro got involved in this. We had Vestergaard give 1.2 million insecticide-treated bed nets. All right, so I can go on with the story. I can tell you it goes on and on. Once you get the success factor going, which Brian was talking about, and which, right, Peter was talking about, you get the success factor going, it starts to build. So you ended up having McKesson give caregiver kits, 50,000 caregiver kits from right, medical supply group, right? So they kept, and they would renew their. I had vitamin A mebendazole, 12 million tabs being given a year, right? So deworming and vitamin A supplementation through the Ministry of Health. It was given over 5 years, right? So 6 million kids are dewormed and vitamin A supplemented every 6 months in their school system. Just became part and parcel. So I can go on. Coach Moxall was good.
So
So
Bruce-
last
Bruce,
thing I'll
yeah.
do, we integrated this piece within the government with government advisors. We put people within government ministries. We shaped government policy around children and around what should be happening at that level. We had the NFL. We got all of the NFL that's produced, right, for the winners. Remember, they all produce they have it from both teams. It's all set up. Whoever's going to win, right, in all the playoff games, all the merchandise is already produced. Guess where all that merchandise came for 6 years? To what I call the champions of HIV and AIDS. And they got all the NFL merchandise coming into Zambia for distribution to the caregivers and their networks. So on and on you go, you build. And so what we found was we brought these partners into specific areas they could help. We got Pearson to give 4 containers of brand new educational materials on every year for 5 years. Right.
So Bruce, yeah, I want to jump in here just because we're going to run out of time. But the examples that both of you have given really seem like and you've done incredible things and twisting some arms to get companies to step up and donate lots of products. So, but it definitely seems, these examples seem like they were built a lot on the CSR model, and you can create real value through CSR models. And Brenda, you talked a lot about partnership, or the kind of relationship building as being a really important piece. Shawn, you mentioned in your beginning remarks even about how, I think, the tech industry perhaps realizing through some maybe missteps that relationship building was also an important piece. I want to actually bring in a little bit of this thinking around shared value, where we can actually think about where there's the business opportunity for the private sector and your ways to partner that actually can create competitive advantages for the private sector, and how does, when that's the case, how does that change your value proposition and how you think about partnering? Is it sort of a different equation? Is it sort of different things that you're looking for to sort of get out of the partnership, presumably? And how does that affect even how you think about who to partner with? So, I mean, anyone can jump in on this.
Thank you. So that, let me take the last question first, because the answer is a variable that affects me and affects other organizations. It might be, it's easier for some big tech companies to engage in opportunities like this where the market is zero or approaching zero, because it's very clearly outside of the commercial business model. It's not something the capital markets or Wall Street would have an opinion on. And if you have a Venn diagram where you have something with zero opportunity for commercialization, and it intersects with, for example, the CEO's personal interest, and it intersects with having some subject matter expert or someone who can engage in the community, I would say that's in some cases ideal. As soon as you have a market opportunity, that is going to slot it in a completely different direction with a completely different set of stakeholders who have targets that they have to reach and are going to evaluate it, and it's a different set of people. Not all the time, and it's not that stark, but that informs sometimes questions that you get. So if you went out to the private sector, in this case big tech, and you said, we'd like you to do X, they may ask you some very odd initial questions that you wouldn't think. Tell me an exact geography down to the city level, or tell me, is this through the government or is this through who's giving the most, where's the money coming from? Well, they're not asking for the reason you think. They're asking because their organization is completely matrixed out. So if you say it's Merck, that's one person. If it's Exxon, that's a different person. If it's an NGO, it's a different person. If it's a Minister of Health, it's a completely different person. And so the first thing they ask you isn't even going to be about, is this amazing? How many lives would you save? They know that at some level, but really what they're going to do is handicap how likely is this to actually be pulled off is based on who's the proper person that it's going to get routed to. And so in some cases, if there are folks out there who want to bring in big tech, number one, you have to ask, you have to invite us. Number two, you have to be willing to sort of figure out who you want to work with and how that's going to be done, and be willing to accept some sort of odd questions at the beginning, perhaps. I forgot even what the question was, so hopefully I don't know if I answered that. Okay, good.
So, I mean, briefly, I do think that if it's more of a shared value approach, it is a different value proposition, and you're also looking at potentially different sets of partners, and maybe some, I would characterize it as more unusual partners, so not sort of your traditional groups. I'll give a quick example. I should say that we are actually moving more towards a shared value approach, while we still feel like philanthropy has its place. This idea of being able to contribute to a cause from a social perspective, but to do so in a way that also has potential business benefit, appeals to us for a number of reasons, including the fact that we think it does probably increase the chances of sustainability. So real quickly, I'll give an example. We launched an initiative a few years ago in India, actually, around the sale of one of our, or the provision of one of our hepatitis C drugs, where we entered into a partnership with a financing institution to help the community figure out a way to afford the medicine. So affordability was an issue. This was a microfinancing initiative that allowed the provision of funding where we paid the interest on those loans, but it enabled the communities and the people that were in need of this medicine to not have to worry about sort of that upfront cost of medication. What it did is it solved an issue where you had folks that were in need of this medication, but through standard mechanisms could not afford it. But it also enabled us to enter a market where previously we were not able to. So I think, that's an example of how the value proposition is a little bit different there, because it actually kind of opened up a market for us. It handed us a new tool in terms of this whole idea of microfinancing, and now we're looking for other ways to utilize that and get more into the innovative financing space. So it was a nice sort of entree into that space.
Can I just add one thing? Please. So here's a story about that, maybe. You mentioned, Brenda, things into the future. So one of the things I think any of the big tech companies would be willing to invest forward in is things that will happen in the future. And I got a call last year from someone who was working for the CEO of a big drug company, and they said, we want to do a trial in India, and there's new technology that will allow, if someone reads a script, a young pre-adolescent or adolescent reads a script on a phone, technology can figure out maybe what the chances are that they're pre-symptomatic schizophrenia, they're at risk for schizophrenia, and yet they're pre-symptomatic. And I think the further out the opportunity is, the less one is able to truly value it today. But there's a lot of risk, and this goes to some of the private capital on the sidelines or dry powder that Dr. Singer mentioned. There's a lot of willingness to look at that. And so let me get to something very specific. So precision public health was mentioned. So there's a wonderful paper, a peer-reviewed paper called Big Data's Role in Precision Public Health, which I wrote, so you should read it. But precision, the word precision in precision public health to us means technology. And I was sitting with Scott Dowell at Gates, and instantly he talks about maps. So on the Cloudera has a foundation now, and it was Claudia Yush from Rockefeller who came over to be the CEO of it. And one of her first investments is going to be with an institution that helps manually curate maps. And these are maps that will show a village from a satellite in Africa where theoretically there's no village there and no one needs to go out and do vaccinations, but there's really a village there. And that's just part of this whole landscape of precision. Now, that is something where no one from Cloudera Foundation is going back to Cloudera and saying, this is going to build our capabilities around precision, because guess what? 10 years from now, we're going to be doing a whole lot more. It's easier for us to do that under the radar, no pun intended, if there's something there. But the net is, there are so many ways. Any project that's out there, I guarantee you, has at least 2 ways of incubating more knowledge, even regardless of the data. Just knowledge about how to do a piece of technology that's going to have to be expanded on. That's it.
Thank you. I'm watching this clock tick down, and we're going to be bringing the audience in here in a little bit, but I want to get a couple more issues on the table. Maybe just quickly, Bruce, we haven't talked as much on the risks and challenges and around sort of being able to get that value creation. Is there any thoughts you want to add out here for sort of quick food for thought in terms of where you see that either from the CSR or even more on the shared value side?
Yeah, I think it's also relative to the type of magnitude of what you want to address, because I think sometimes these partnerships should really be gauged towards something that's out of the, beyond government, it's beyond the international organization. It needs everyone to come together. So I think there's great possibility that creates enough of what I would call enough of the energy to actually go after a big challenge. Let me give you an example. I sit on a board of Partners in Food Solutions, and it's Cargill, DSM, General Mills, Hershey, Bueller, Ardent Mills, the large agro businesses, U.S., Switzerland, and Holland. And the reason this was started was so that they could create an opportunity for their employees, a little bit like the Merck program, to go and partner with small to medium-sized African agro-businesses to help them solve specific problems. It could be shelf life issue, nutritional content, sourcing, milling issues that they had. They brought their expertise. They released their scientists to work on very well-scoped projects. We are working with 568 enterprises now in Africa, all right? And these are small to medium-sized businesses. And they're bringing their scientists to play in helping them solve their issues. And so it is a huge attraction for people wanting to join. And so the whole value proposition, if you would like, was that they were thinking this is going to help them attract employees and retain employees, because they have many employees who would love to give their skill sets to volunteer and to help in other places. Well, what they've realized in this now is that these businesses in Africa are small and medium-sized. They are absolutely thriving because of this expertise that's at their disposal. So now there's a real sort of understanding of the market for these companies. And originally this was more along the philanthropic, it's for us to get their employees to engagement and attraction. Now they're saying, there's a huge market. Fastest growing population in the world, Africa. Where's the food needs going to be the greatest? Production capacities. All of a sudden, it shifted their mindset in terms of appreciating what the business opportunities could be for them. And some of them are taking decisions to move in that direction. Now, do you call that shared value? They have decisions to make along that continuum. Yet what they're doing right now is absolutely brilliant, because they're increasing small farmer holding to contribute to these, and they're actually setting up very viable, very well managed businesses that are small and medium sized now that are growing, and many of them are minority owned. So I would just say that there are multiple models, and that model could be something I think that is more formalized. Merck does it in a certain way. There's a few companies, but there's a place in which the expertise and the residency of all that commensurate knowledge. I use the U.S. health system as an amazing example. Bruce Compton's here from Catholic Health. We take some of that capacity that's in Catholic Health and apply that in very low resource income settings. You don't realize the asset we're sitting on sometimes in terms of our know-how, and that can be transferred. So I would just say that transfer know-how also leads to an understanding of markets and to business opportunities. Is that shared value defined on the front end? I don't.
So I just really fast, because I want to get this out here, because this is actually a big interest of mine and has been for a long time. And I know we're not supposed to be talking about models quite yet, but the models are really so integrally tied to how you create value. And one of the things I've been really interested in is as we've seen partnerships evolve over time, can we start to move to not just multi-stakeholder partnerships, because often we've got different stakeholders, but they tend to be from different sectors. Where can we start to bring in stakeholders from the same sector that all have sort of a shared interest in solving a problem? And can you sort of collectively bring a sector together in a way to tackle a problem? So in the health sector, the easy one is thinking about how do you actually, if you can strengthen health systems, you're strengthening channels, various types of market channels, so you can actually start to penetrate different markets and get greater market share. And so all companies might have a shared interest in actually doing that. How do you work together to do that? Because so many of these partnerships that we've seen have been ones where they become sort of one-off pieces that tend to not be very sustainable. And if you actually work together, could you have this magnified impact, kind of going from retail to wholesale, as I talk about. And so, Brenda, we talked about this earlier, and you said you might even, and there's certainly challenges with that. There's branding challenges. You talked about how that you might even be shifting at Merck a little bit more toward that based on some lessons. Shawn, you mentioned on the phone that the tech sector, there's some antibodies to that. We need to get the audience in, so can you just give me maybe really quick responses on that, and maybe we'll get into it a little bit more.
Let me start. Yeah, and I get this question a lot, and I guess I continue to be a little bit surprised by it because I feel like we've been moving in this direction for several years now. I do agree that years ago it was, and I've been around long enough to be able to speak to this, unfortunately, but years ago it was about branding. So you wanted to be the only private sector company or the only healthcare company that was engaging on a particular initiative so that the branding was all about you. I think that's starting to shift. I know it definitely is shifting at Merck, where there's a recognition that if you bring in more partners and more companies, even from your own industry, it de-risks what you're doing. It reduces the burden and the cost. It brings more innovation to the table because you don't know everything, and there are other companies that probably have practices that you're not familiar with, and it helps you get to scale and impact probably faster and in a more impactful way. So I think that, for us at least, has become much more important than the branding factor. And I'll say the work that we're doing. The industry is doing with the Gates Foundation around the Gates Global Health Roundtable is a great example of this. It is not easy, especially when you have 14 companies around the table. I can attest to that. But there's definitely proof points in that the work of the roundtable that show why it makes sense to move in this direction.
Yeah, super quick. So I started and moderated a working group in real-world evidence that I was very surprised, pleasantly so, that we had something like 6 different big pharma organizations on, and everyone had said all these things like, oh, pharma won't say anything or they won't work together. I said, we're not recording this. You don't have to, share anything. And as long as you're not recording this, they would be amazingly collaborative. And in tech, what I would say is the key is, if there's 4 big tech companies, even 3, and you go out to some other ones and say, this is your opportunity to be in this club, but if you don't do it now, you're not going to be in this. And instantly they think in their mind, I can see the press release 2 years from now, and the board says, did you see that? Why weren't you on this thing? So to some degree it's risk mitigation. Now, that might be like a clever ploy, and obviously there needs to be something more than that. But yeah, so I'd love to explain or my position on how to do that, but we don't have time for that. So let's just say it's eminently doable.
Good. All right, well, I would love to follow up on that, but I promised to bring you all in, so let's open it up for questions, please. Starting with tables, any questions? Here, please.
Hello, Gabriella Morris from UNICEF USA. I want to follow up on that question about the collaborative involving a foundation, because you haven't really talked about shared value partnerships in terms of how you bring a foundation partner in. So I'm just curious as to how that would shape your thoughts about joining a collaborative, or You know, which way does that work for you?
Just a point of clarification, when you say foundation, are you talking more of the NGO community or company
Funding,
foundations?
The funding private
Or
foundations.
like a Gates Foundation?
Yes, working with industry. So I don't think we've really talked about that from the shared value perspective.
I mean, I'll just give a quick opinion, and I think it would be probably helpful to hear from Bruce about sort of the NGO perspective on that. But I know for us, we see the Gates Foundation, the big foundations, as definitely an important partner. From a financing perspective, I think they bring a lot to the table. From an expertise perspective, they bring a lot to the table. I know, in my world, the Merck Foundation has some strict rules around it in terms of how closely we can get to a business purpose while they can sort of ride together. Anything that's financed out of the Merck Foundation has to be 100% charitable. So that's where the shared value approach has to exclude the Merck Foundation. But I do think there's opportunities for some of these larger foundations and also the NGO community to get involved in the shared value space. And it's one thing I've often wondered, how do the nonprofits look at the shared value space? I know we find it really intriguing and useful and valuable, but I'm not sure how the rest of the world looks at it.
So you're at UNICEF, is that right? Okay, so UNICEF Innovation Labs has some great scientists working on Magic Box, and Elisa Omide, who I think is amazing. And I would say they've created some technology around creating data lakes that are adaptive in epidemic scenarios. Super smart, and so the risk there is, do they even think they need help? My bet is they didn't come out to big tech and say, I shouldn't say that. I think they picked some certain partners and they do things with certain partners, and that's absolutely great. What I would say is we want to be more invited, and we have the ability in these cases where there's no market. So, what are the chances we're going to go do this mission? We're not going to do this mission, right? So then there's zero cost for us to contribute. So anyway, sorry.
John.
A question, I guess, in the context of shared value at some scale, I thought it was terrific. Brenda and Bruce and Shawn, you all articulated various pieces of the value proposition, which is more than money and markets. And I guess it seems to me for a partnership to work, it's really important for all the partners to understand how each other sees the value proposition. So when you've negotiated these things, have there been better processes or worse in terms of coming away thinking everybody at the table gets this? The NGO gets it, the company gets it, the government. What works better? Because I don't think it would be obvious that everybody you'd be partnering with would understand all the dimensions of value you see here. And it seems it's more sustainable if people get why other players are at the table. Is that fair? I don't.
No, it's a great question, and it's very fair. So I haven't experienced a conversation around the table about the value proposition per se. We've talked about why we think we should be involved, and we've heard other potential partners around the table talk about why they should be involved. And I actually think that what you're raising is really important, because I do think that that's an important conversation, and I would actually broaden it to having a conversation about expectations related to the value proposition, because I know, we've found that sometimes we've entered into these partnerships, whether they're philanthropic, shared, whatever it might be, and the expectations of our company, for example, were not necessarily what we thought they were, or we found that they were greater than we thought they were. So I actually think the key to all of that is very open, honest communications from the beginning, which lays out why the partners are around the table. And again, I'm going to refer to Brian's talk when he said, companies are really good at talking about what they do, how they do it, but the why is not always articulated, and I think that even goes beyond companies and understanding from your partners, why are they at the table? So I think it's a great point.
I would add the one good question in the beginning is, what does success look like for you as a partner? And then once you get a little bit of that dialogue going, you then go to the next question is, how do you want to measure this? And when you get into measurement, you get into because they know that the measurement's going to be, and then you're going to have the comms plan developed because of what your measurement's going to show you. So I think you move from that success to measurement and into the comms space, and then you give credit to all, and you agree in the beginning that it is going to be that open, transparent place. And that's a hard place to be because everybody's got their brand police behind them in their group, right? And how is that going to be projected? So it's a complex dialogue, but it is better, I think, in my view, to have it early as possible, as very, very early.
And one now to add is specific, brutally specific to a 4-year-old level, and that can flush out a lot of stuff later.
Yeah, and I'm really glad you brought up measurement because it was another piece I wanted to make sure we brought out into the conversation. I'm curious, so as partnerships develop, we've been in plenty of places where you have your shared objectives and figure out how you're going to measure them. Are there any sort of behind-the-scene measures that you might sort of bring to the table that maybe you actually don't put out there for the larger partnership, but might be things that your own institution might hold you accountable for?
She's looking at me. You're giving me that look, Wendy. So we just don't do a great job on measurement. I hope that doesn't get me into trouble, but we don't. And that's one of the areas we're constantly looking for best practices and guidance. We do measure what we do more today than we ever did. I think we still struggle, particularly in more the social investments, beyond things like lives saved, people treated, which are more outputs than outcomes. I think we do struggle a little bit with how do we show impact and demonstrate success. I think when you're talking about a commercial model or a shared value model, on the business side versus the social side, it's easier because you probably do have market targets or some type of traditional business targets that you can speak to. So I think it's a really important thing. I think Bruce is absolutely right in terms of how important it is. I think, though, we can all do a better job of it. I don't think we're where we need to be.
I think one of the less specified but clear metrics would be relationships, or let's say introductions to folks, to people that you guys would touch more often than we would touch. So, senior management of my company has no idea that I'm here today, but I'll meet someone that 2 years from now Clarion will introduce me to say, would your CEO like to visit the president of Nigeria? And then I call the CEO and say, would you like to meet the president of Nigeria? And they say, who is this guy, Dolley? What's he doing? And I, 2 weeks ago, had the idea, I thought, I'm going to have to talk to our guy that talks to Wall Street and say, I'm probably going to be invited to Davos. And the CEO is going to be like, well, why aren't I invited? Why are you invited to Davos and I'm not invited to Davos? And so that, I don't know what you would call that, but that ability to bring things to the table that no one else can achieve just with money, but rather through relationships, and that if you have some goodwill that you can spend by introducing, like you could say, well, Shawn, I can get your CEO on the phone with the CEO of Hasbro. That's impossible for us to achieve unless we have that. So you have riches that you don't know about that you could spend.
I think I see a card back up on the back table here. And actually, before you go, and I think we're running, I'm watching this clock and not that clock, so maybe, are we still good? Okay, just go with this one. Okay, so 1 minute, but I'm going to have you all, while she's asking her question, just think of your Twitter soundbite on a sort of a key lesson, key takeaway that you want everybody to to have. I'm sorry, I'm so mean. Question, please.
Hi, sir. I'll make it very quick then. I had product development and medicines for malaria venture. So the stress is on development, which often takes in pharma industry about a decade. So my question is possibly to Brenda, but maybe to Shawn as well. In your opinion, what is the willingness of industry to engage in research and development projects versus access projects, where you have a much easier target and a more visible one?
Yeah, so just quickly, in the interest of time, so I think it's a great question, but I think, and I won't speak for the whole industry, although I do think that this is common across the industry, we are more and more getting involved not only in access initiatives, but R&D initiatives. We have opened up our compound libraries to various groups as a way of expanding the research that we do. So if we don't have the expertise within our four walls, by opening up our compound libraries, it's bringing in other expertise and actually expanding the research. So that's one way we've done it. The challenge is that companies focus in certain areas where they feel they have the best expertise to make a difference and come forward with an innovative product. So you're always juggling those priorities of where are you going to put those resources and those constrained resources versus something else. So there's always that opportunity cost that creates one of the challenges for whether it's an R&D partnership or even an access partnership.
Great. Thank you all. And so I just wanted,
I just wanted to elaborate and just add one or two more quick points to what Brenda said about R&D, is that more and more, as Brenda said, we are getting into R&D. And in fact, just speaking of one or two examples, Johnson & Johnson, for example, we have a whole R&D unit that is similar to what you would have, like, say, in oncology or immunology or what have you, but totally focused on a global public health portfolio, TB, HIV, vaccines, dengue, a lot of different areas, NTDs. But also, we talked earlier about the roundtable, the CEO roundtable. And so one of the conversations that has been happening around the roundtable is also, if there are companies that actually have R&D assets, but are themselves not wanting to invest in bringing that forward, can we all collaborate together to take those R&D assets and bring it forward in a collaborative way with other, in a public-private partnership sort of way. So that's the conversation that's also going on with the R&D leaders of the industry and those in the public sector. So it's happening, I think.
Great, thank you. And Seema was really just buying you guys time to form your value proposition takeaway tweet. So Bruce, I'm going to start with you.
I'm going to help you on this one because I've been in so many of these, and I'm more of a practitioner, and I actually get out, make it happen, and work them. Deep down, you got to have a love for what you're doing together. If you're in one of these really odd cabals of bringing all these odd bedfellows together in terms of a really deep partnership to solve things that are really important for people's lives and their well-being, and you're not excited and you're not in love with what you're doing, go sell cars or something. I don't know. But I would just say that you develop a passion, and if you're going to be in a partnership, passion and love in a partnership does help to drive for better results. It really does.
Okay, you have to stick to the 140 or 200
Okay,
some
I'll do
characters.
it. Invite big tech to the global health party. Be patient. We may surprise you. Sorry.
So I was going to say something very similar. I would just say, recognize the value that the private sector can bring to public health. Even if you don't think we could be a good partner, and I was going to say the same thing, you might be surprised.
All right, excellent. Well, with that, let's thank all of our panelists for a really good discussion.